In the autumn of 1883, on the short grass prairie of Colfax County in the New Mexico Territory, a wooden windmill stood on the edge of a homestead claim that no bank would touch and no surveyor had visited in 11 years. It was a tall mill, as such things went on the plains, 4 stories of Douglas fir, framing gone gray with sun, the vanes cracked and half missing, the gearbox seized above from rust and neglect. The claim around it was 240 acres of rolling dry grass with one spring-fed creek that barely earned the name, and a sod house that had caved in at the roof the winter previous. There was also a grain bin, a round-walled structure of mortised cedar planks, and a tin dome, pushed up against the windmill's base like a child leaning against a fence post. The bin stood 12 feet tall and perhaps 16 across. Its door faced west and was held shut by a rusted iron hasp and a padlock no one had thought to ask about in over a decade. Nora Callum was 27 years old when she paid the surveyor's office $9.50 for the quitclaim deed to that property at a tax lien auction in the county seat of Springer. The other bidders, 6 men representing 3 cattle outfits and 1 speculator out of Santa Fe, had walked away from the parcel after a single circuit of the land. One of them laughed as she raised her hand. He said, loud enough to carry, that the only thing that Windmill was good for was to fall down and maybe hurt the next fool who walked under it. The auctioneer offered no rebuttal. He took her money and gave her the deed with the same expression he wore for every transaction, which was the expression of a man who had learned to keep his face unreadable in the presence of other people's mistakes. She did not look at the laughing man again. She folded the deed into the breast pocket of her wool coat, walked to her mule, and started the 14 miles back to what was now hers. She had a name for it already, though she told no one. She called it the Colfax claim. That was enough. If you have ever watched someone dismiss a thing and feel the certainty that they are wrong, you know something of what Nora carried on that 14-mile ride. It is not a comfortable feeling. It sits in the chest like an unripe apple, pressing rather than nourishing, and it does not resolve until the work is done. She had learned not to speak of it. Speaking of it invited questions she did not yet have answers to, and questions without answers invited doubt, and doubt invited the kind of paralysis her father had called the enemy of all mechanical work. You do not fix a mill by standing below it and wondering if you can. You climb the frame. Nora had come to the territory with her father, George Callum, 12 years before, when she was 15 and he was still healthy enough to survey and build. George Callum had been a millwright, a man who built and repaired watermills, windmills, and the grain processing structures attached to them. He had carried his trade from Ohio to Missouri to Kansas, and finally to New Mexico when the land companies began offering parcels for development surveys. He was not a talkative man, and he did not believe in wasted motion. What he believed in, and what he communicated to his daughter through action rather than lecture, was the interior language of mills. That a mill was a mechanism before it was a building. That every piece of it served a function, and that function, when understood precisely, told you where the mill had been and what it had been asked to do. He had taught her to read gearing. He had taught her to date timber by the pitch of its grain and the color of its oxidation. He had taught her that a seized gearbox was not a dead machine. It was a machine that had been stopped deliberately or by accident, and the difference was always visible to someone who knew where to look. He had taught her to read a floor for what it had held, and to read a lock for how long it had been closed. These were not lessons with a preamble. They were the things he did when she stood near enough to see, and she stood near as often as she could, and she remembered what she saw. He died of a lung complaint in the spring of 1880 in a rented room in Raton, and left her his tools, his surveying instruments, and a small notebook of mechanical drawings he had made over the years. He left her no money. The territory was not short of men who owed George Callum wages they had not paid. She had spent 3 years doing what work she could, surveying small claims for settlers who could not afford the county's official rates, repairing windmills and stock pumps for ranch outfits, once spending an entire winter rebuilding a water wheel at a flour mill near Cimarron, whose owner paid her in sacks of grain she sold back to him at a discount. She saved carefully, spent nothing she did not have to spend, and watched the tax line rolls when they were published each autumn. She was looking for something specific, the way a person looks for a particular face in a crowd. She would know it when she saw it. When she saw the Colfax claim and its windmill listed in the Springer Gazette's legal notices, she had ridden out to look at it before the auction date. She went on a Wednesday, alone, telling no one where she was going, which was her custom before any purchase she was seriously considering. She had learned that other people's opinions about a piece of property were useful only if you were not sure what you thought yourself, and she was almost always sure. What she wanted was not an opinion. She wanted a day with the thing in question, her tools, and no one else's voice in her ear. The ride out from Springer took the better part of 3 hours on a mule that was reliable rather than fast. The road ran north along a dry creek bottom and then cut west across open range, and the windmill was visible for the last 4 miles. A dark vertical stroke on the pale grass horizon, taller than she had expected from the land notice's description. She stopped half a mile out and looked at it for several minutes before continuing. The vanes were still in the morning air. The framing read true at that distance, the tower's 4 corner posts holding their plumb against the blue October sky, despite the obvious weathering of the timber. A structure that has failed catastrophically does not hold its plumb. This one had not failed. It had simply stopped, and the reason something stops is always different from the reason something fails. And that difference was worth $9.50 of anybody's money to understand. The windmill was worse than the notice suggested, and better than the laughter of those 6 men implied. She climbed the frame in the early morning while the wind was still, testing each cross-member with her weight before committing to it, the way her father had taught her. Press, hold, release, and if the wood takes the weight without speaking, move up. The timber was gray and checked at the surface but sound at the core. Douglas fir held its heart long after its face gave out. The gearbox was seized as expected, but the seizing was recent, not historical. The rust on the brake lever was old. The rust on the gearbox housing was old. The rust that had locked the shaft was new, the kind that forms when water has been introduced into a mechanism that has been sitting still, not when a mechanism has been slowly failing in place over years. New rust has a particular orange brightness at its edges, almost warm like a coal just catching. Old rust is brown-black and layered, built up over seasons. She touched both with her fingertips and noted the difference, and came down from the frame with a fact she had not had before. Someone had poured water into that gearbox. Within the last year, she estimated. Possibly within the last 6 months. She had come down from the frame and walked around the grain bin. The cedar planks were tight, the joints straight, the work of someone who knew what they were building. The hasp and padlock were rusted, but the hasp screws were not loose in the wood. Whoever had last used this structure had not neglected it. She had knelt in the thin grass at the base of the bin's south wall and pressed her palm to the lowest plank. The wood was dry and slightly warm from the morning sun. No rot at the ground line, no soft give that announced decay working up from the soil. The bin had been built on a poured limestone pad, which was unusual for this kind of structure on a homestead parcel. Limestone pads cost money. They required planning and materials not easily sourced on the open range. They were used where the contents of a structure needed to be kept dry and stable over many years, not over 1 or 2 seasons. She had noted all of this and said nothing to anyone. Patience, her father had said, is not a virtue. It is a tool. It is for when you are not ready yet to act on what you know. The morning after the auction, Nora loaded her mule cart with the tool chest, 2 weeks of provisions, bedding, a spare lantern, 2 cans of penetrating oil, a pry bar, her masonry chisel, and the small French compass her father had carried since Missouri. She covered the load with an oilcloth and tied it down with half hitches, the way he had shown her for a long haul. Then she drove 14 miles north on a road that was barely a road, a pair of wheel tracks in the dry grass, and pulled up to the sod house on the Colfax claim as the sun came level with the horizon behind her and laid her shadow out long and thin across the ground. If you have ever arrived alone at a piece of land that belongs to you and felt the particular silence of a thing waiting to be worked, you know what she found when she stepped down from the cart. The sod house needed the roof section addressed before she could sleep in it. She cut new sod from the creek bank and fit the blocks into the collapsed section and weighted them with stones from the dry wash. It was not fine work. It was not meant to be. She had done similar repair on a homestead outside Wagon Mound the previous spring for a widow who could not manage the ladder herself, and it took her an afternoon because she knew the work. The house was livable by dark. She ate at the door, watching the windmill's silhouette in the last light, the motionless veins cutting the sky into sections. What she was saving the careful work for was the gearbox, and beyond the gearbox, the grain bin. She spent the second day setting her tools in order, every blade sharpened, every joint oiled, every wrench sorted to the bolts she intended to use it on. Her father had kept his tools in a particular arrangement and never varied it, not because he was fastidious by nature, but because a man working 20 feet above the ground in a wind gust cannot afford to reach for a wrench and find nothing. The arrangement was a kind of memory stored in the hands rather than the head. She arranged hers the same way. The third day she addressed the gearbox. She climbed the frame for the second time and unbolted the gearbox cover with her father's Sheffield wrench, the heavy piece with the jaw she had filed to fit. The cover came off with resistance and then with a clean give, and the interior of the housing presented itself in the morning light. The gear faces were bright under the rust-stained housing oil. Surface corrosion only, she confirmed, the kind that comes from introduced moisture sitting for months in a sealed space. The gears themselves were cast iron of a better grade than most field-erected mills used. She could see the finer grain of the metal where she scraped a test patch with her thumbnail. The scratch, clean and bright, and slightly silvered. The shaft was locked by a single bolt of rust on the starboard bearing race. She worked penetrating oil into the race for 2 hours, tamping it with a rag wrapped around a stick cut to the right diameter, letting it sit, adding more, letting it sit again. Her father had been patient with oil in a way she had learned was not patience at all, but precision. The oil needed time to creep into the spaces it was meant to occupy, and hurrying it produced nothing except the illusion of action. She waited. She trimmed the wick on the lantern she had balanced on the frame to give her working light. She checked the other bearings. She tightened one loose bolt on the bull wheel mounting plate. Then she applied the bearing puller to the race. It came loose in 2 strokes with a sound like a gate latch releasing, a short metallic percussion she felt through the wrench handle before she heard it. She pulled the shaft through a quarter turn by hand. It moved. She stepped back and let the wind take it. The vanes began to rotate. The sound of a working windmill is not one sound. It is a chain of sounds, the pull of wind on the fan, the rotation communicating down through the connecting rod, the reciprocating pump working in its sleeve below ground, and underneath all of it, the low percussion of the gearbox, running true. She stood on the frame while it found its rhythm, one hand on a crossmember, not holding herself up so much as confirming what she felt through the wood, the whole structure coming alive as a system rather than as separate parts. Her father had sometimes closed his eyes when he did this, the better to feel the resonance in the framing. She did not close her eyes because she was 20 feet off the ground, and she was not her father. But she understood the impulse. She came down from the frame in the early dark and went to the sod house and made herself a meal and slept without difficulty. The fourth day, she opened the grain bin. The padlock was a lever tumbler type, likely manufactured in the 1860s or early 1870s. The design recognizable from the profile of its housing, even through the rust coating. Her father had treated locks as a category of mechanism, no more mysterious than a gear train, and had taught her the lever tumbler as an example of a simple machine operating at very fine tolerance. A key was nothing more than a shaped piece of metal that moved levers in a sequence that allowed the bolt to pass. She had opened a dozen of them in her working years, sometimes with a key she had cut to match a worn original, sometimes with a slender pick she carried in the tool chest for exactly this eventuality. She tried the pick first, spent 10 minutes at it, and concluded that the tumbler corrosion was too complete for that approach. She did not force the lock. Instead, she examined the hasp screws, which were set into the door frame's edge grain, and found that the wood, which had looked sound from outside, had given slightly to moisture at some point in the past and then dried, and the screws pulled cleanly from the frame with a half-inch of gentle pry from her flat bar. She caught the hasp and the padlock together and set them aside. She would reuse them. The door swung open on iron hinges that moved more quietly than she expected, the pins well fitted and the knuckles cast rather than forged, a detail she noted and filed without stopping. The smell came first. Cedar, as expected, warm and faintly sweet. Something beneath it, the particular mineral dryness of limestone dust and old air. Beneath that, fainter, a petroleum smell she could not immediately place. She let the door stand open while the wind moved through, dissipating whatever had been sealed in. She counted to 100 slowly. Then she lit the lantern and stepped inside. The bin was empty of grain. The floor was the same poured limestone as the pad outside, clean and flat, and that was the second unusual thing. Grain bins of this construction typically had a packed earth floor. Limestone flooring was for a space where you meant to store something that could not tolerate moisture wicking up from the soil over years. In the center of the floor there were 4 iron rings set flush into the limestone, each the size of a handspan, each bolted through the pad with large diameter hardware she could see at the edge of each ring's flange. They were the kind of rings used to secure freight crates in a wagon bed, or to tie down heavy cargo for transport by rail. They were not in any ordinary use of a grain storage structure, the kind of hardware a man bolted into a floor. She crouched and ran her fingers around the ring nearest the door. No grain residue anywhere near it, no organic dust, no sign the floor had ever been used as a storage surface. She looked at the spacing of the 4 rings. They formed a rectangle roughly 6 feet by 4, centered in the floor and oriented north to south. She took from her coat pocket the small French compass her father had carried since Missouri, a 30-year piece in a brass case that he had kept oiled and tested annually against a known bearing. She held it level above the center of the ring rectangle and waited for the needle to settle. The needle swung and held north, as expected. She moved the compass to the edge of the rectangle, near the ring that sat at what she estimated as the northeast corner, and held it level again. The needle pulled east, Not sharply, not violently, but distinctly, drawn by something below the limestone surface that was not the rings themselves, which were too small to produce that degree of pull at compass distance. The deflection was consistent with iron at depth, significant iron, not nails or brackets. There was something substantial under the floor. The 5th and 6th days she spent removing the limestone floor in the marked rectangle. The work was methodical and not quick. She worked with the masonry chisel and the small sledge, tapping rather than striking, reading the limestone for the lines where it wanted to release. Her father had shown her once, on a pier he was demolishing at a grist mill in Kansas, how poured limestone could be read like rock if you had patience. It followed its pour lines, the boundaries between layers of material laid down at different times, and those lines were not always visible to the eye, but could be felt as a slight change in resistance when you pressed a chisel edge across them. She wetted the floor with water from her canteen and watched it dry, and the seams showed themselves as lines of slightly darker stone where the water held a moment longer. 2 pours. The second smaller than the first and finished more carefully, the surface tooled to match the surrounding floor. Someone had worked to hide that seam. She took up the second pour in sections, each piece lifting cleanly once she had run the chisel along its full perimeter. Under the second pour there was a layer of packed adobe, 8 inches deep, and in the adobe, set on a bed of dry sand, a wooden box of pine construction sealed with pitch on every seam and bolted through its lid to iron plates that in turn sat in the adobe below, the bolts the source of the compass deflection. The box was approximately 5 feet by 3 feet and 8 inches deep. She did not open it immediately. She cleaned the sand and adobe from its top surface with a bristle brush she kept in the tool chest for cleaning gear teeth. She examined the bolt patterns, 4 bolts in a square arrangement at each corner of the lid, the heads large and flat, and seated flush into the wood. She noted the pitch seals, which were intact and uncracked, the wood having been shielded from temperature variation by the double layer of limestone and adobe above it. She pressed her palm to the top surface of the box. It was dry, completely dry, even at the corners where moisture would have found its way in first, if there had been any way in. The pitch had held for however many years the box had been down there. The limestone pad had held. The cedar bin walls had held. Whoever had built this had built it to last. She thought about that for a moment, crouching there with her hand on the lid. Someone had done careful work here. Someone had understood that what they were sealing into that floor needed to survive not just the next season, but an indefinite number of seasons for an unknown amount of time, until an unknown person came along who would know what they were looking at. She estimated the box had been sealed in its current state for at least 8 years, possibly longer, based on the state of the sand below it, which had compressed under the weight into a cohesive layer rather than remaining loose. She lifted the box onto the limestone floor with the pry bar and her own strength, which was adequate for the weight. She carried it to the sod house and set it on the table she had made from planks and sawhorses. She ate her supper first, 2 biscuits and cold beans and water from the creek, before she unsealed the pitch and lifted the lid. The box held 12 ledger volumes bound in black cloth, 1 tin cartridge case containing 74 folded documents, and 1 small glass jar sealed with wax, which held a single folded piece of paper. The ledgers were the accounts of a man named Aldous Vane, who had operated as a land agent in Colfax County from 1869 to 1875, acting nominally on behalf of the Maxwell Land Grant Company, but in practice operating as a private intermediary who sold parcels he did not own to settlers who did not know they were buying land. Another party had already been promised. The double sales were recorded in the ledgers in a coded notation that took her half a day to decipher. It was not a sophisticated cipher. Vane had replaced names with numbers and transposed parcel references, but he had not bothered to encode the acreage figures, which were the one element that fixed each transaction to a specific piece of land. She held the ledgers against the public plat records she had brought from the county seat and matched figure to figure, number to name. And by the second evening, she had a list of 18 parcel transactions and the names of the families involved in each. She worked at the table by lantern light well past the point when her eyes would have preferred to stop, making a copy in her own hand of the key correspondences between Vane's coded numbers and the real names and parcel identifiers. Her handwriting was her father's handwriting, a trait she had absorbed without meaning to. The same block capitals and the same habit of drawing a vertical line through her sevens to distinguish them from ones. She kept the copies separately from the originals, folded into her surveying notebook, against the possibility that the originals were somehow lost or damaged before she could deliver them to the right person. She was methodical about this, not because she distrusted the world in a general way, but because she understood that a document is only as secure as its least secure copy, and she had exactly one copy of the truth about those 18 parcels. The folded documents in the tin case were copies of the original grant deeds for all 18 parcels, countersigned by Vane in his capacity as agent and witnessed by two names she did not recognize. They were the true instruments of conveyance, the documents that preceded and contradicted the altered copies the company maintained at its Santa Fe office. On 14 of the 18 parcels, homestead families had built, planted, raised children, buried their dead, and in some cases defended the land in territorial court against challengers they did not understand were the rightful original grantees. The piece of paper in the wax jar was in Vane's hand, and she was certain of it because it matched the hand in the ledgers, the particular shape of his capital letters, the way his sevens crossed. It was dated November of 1875, addressed to no one, and it said only this: the ledgers in the box were the true record. The copies held at the company's Santa Fe office had been altered, and the person who found this box had the only complete set of the original transactions, each one documented in a form that could be verified against the federal plat register. It was signed with his initials and nothing else. She read it 3 times in the lantern light. The third time, she set it down on the table and sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the sod house, which was still rough from her repair of the roof section, the new blocks of sod not yet settled into the old material. She had the habit, when she needed to think without acting, of looking at something that had no information in it. Ceilings generally served. Her father had told her once that the most dangerous moment in any mechanical work was the moment after you found the problem and before you had determined the repair, because that was the moment when a man was most likely to do something fast and irreversible. She had always held the pause at that moment. This was that moment. She sat with all of it for a long time that night, the lantern burning down past its usual stopping point. Aldous Vane, she learned from the county clerk's records when she rode to Springer the following week, had died in 1876, drowned in a flash flood on the Cimarron River the spring after he had sealed that box in the grain bin floor. His death had been listed as accidental. The Maxwell Land Grant Company had dissolved its New Mexico operations in 1879, following a federal investigation that reached inconclusive findings, in part because the key documents that would have supported a full accounting could not be located in the Santa Fe office. There having been a fire, as was reported, that destroyed a portion of the records, no fire reached the cedar plank grain bin on the Colfax claim. The former agent in Santa Fe who had handled the altered records was a man named Harker, now semi-retired and living, the county clerk informed her without particular emphasis, in Taos. She spent 3 weeks in Springer working with a land attorney named Fitch, who was known in the county as honest, which in Colfax County in 1883 was a narrower description than it should have been. Fitch was a small man with a large desk, and the habit of reading back what you told him in slightly different words, which she came to understand, was his way of checking that he had understood precisely. He cross-referenced the ledger figures against the current tax rolls and the federal patent records, and produced a finding that covered, by his count, 17 surviving claimants or their heirs who had purchased land under fraudulent instruments. One of the 18 original transactions had involved a parcel already reverted to territorial status before any family settled it, and that one fell outside the remedy Fitch could construct. She paid Fitch with a portion of the windmill repair work she contracted during those 3 weeks in Springer, setting 2 stock pumps and resetting a mill head for ranches on the North Range, who were glad to have someone who could reach the gearbox without sending to Trinidad for a mechanic. Fitch accepted the arrangement without comment. He was not a man who required transactions to look conventional in order to consider them sound. The process of notification and restitution that followed took the better part of a year. It involved the Territorial Land Office, a federal examiner who came down from Denver and stayed 6 weeks, and a great deal of correspondence to addresses in Kansas, Colorado, and Missouri, where several of the original defrauded families had resettled after losing their claims to challengers who had purchased from the company at the altered price. The second buyers being themselves defrauded, though in a different direction. The cases were not simple. Fitch had warned her they would not be. And he was right in the way careful men are, right when they have seen similar problems before. What she had not anticipated, and what she found herself understanding only gradually over those months, was the particular texture of what restitution looked like when it arrived at the door of a family that had spent years believing their loss was their own fault, that they had signed something wrong or failed to understand what they were buying, or that the land simply had not wanted them. 3 of the families Fitch located had moved twice since losing their claims, each move taking them further from the territory and further from any expectation that the original wrong would ever be named. One woman in southeastern Kansas, a widow named Clara Marsh, whose husband had died on the original Colfax parcel before they lost it, wrote to Fitch to say she had spent 7 years assuming the fault was hers. It was a short letter. It said very little beyond the facts of her situation and that she was glad someone had found the papers. Fitch read it aloud to Nora once, in his office, and then folded it and put it back in the file. And they did not discuss it further, but she remembered every word of it in the order it had come. She testified before a land commissioner in Santa Fe for 40 minutes, answering questions about the box, the 2-pour floor, the iron rings, the compass reading, and the padlock, which she had brought with her in a cloth sack and set on the table in front of the commissioner without being asked. The commissioner examined it for some time before setting it aside and continuing with his questions. She answered each one directly. She did not volunteer interpretation. She described what she had seen and done and found, in the order she had seen and done and found it, and let the ledgers speak for themselves in the hands of the federal examiner, who had spent a week verifying their contents against the Federal Register before the hearing. The man named Harker in Taos was notified of the findings by the federal examiner. He did not contest them. The examiner's report described his condition as one of advanced age and poor health, and his response to the notification as cooperative, which was perhaps the territorial examiner's courteous way of noting that a man of 71 with no remaining business interests had very little left to defend. He died the following winter. 11 of the 17 families received some form of restitution through the territorial process. 6 families could not be located despite Fitch's correspondence to the last known addresses. Their remedies went into the territorial record as unresolved claims, which was not a satisfying outcome but was an honest one, and Fitch filed them as carefully as he had filed the rest. Nora Callum filed her own patent claim on the 240 acres and paid the recording fee at the land office in Springer. The claim was uncontested, there being no fraud touching her own purchase, which had been a clean tax lien sale at $9.50, paid in coin. She repaired the windmill to full operating condition over the following spring and summer. The cracked vanes she replaced with fresh-cut fir from a sawmill in Cimarron, shaping them herself with a draw knife and a spoke shave until they balanced correctly when she weighted them on a pivot board, a technique her father had demonstrated once and she had never forgotten. The 4 vanes hanging in pairs on opposite arms of the pivot until all 4 read level. She reseated the bearings she had cleaned and rebuilt the pump rod connection with a new coupling. She had the Smithy and Springer machine to her drawing. The mill pumped water to a stock tank she dug and lined with red rock from the dry wash. She raised 24 head of sheep on the creek-fed grass and sold the wool clip to a merchant in Cimarron at a fair price. She re-poured the limestone floor of the grain bin herself, this time in one pour, level and unbroken. She used it as it was meant to be used, stacking a season's worth of shelled corn in the bin through the winter of 1884, and finding it perfectly dry in the spring, not a kernel spoiled. The cedar planks held. The tin dome held. The limestone pad sat solid on the ground that had been solid under it all along, waiting to be used honestly. The sod house she replaced with a 2-room plank structure in 1886, sawing the lumber herself from timber hauled in 3 trips from the mountains. It was a plain house with its back to the north and its 2 south-facing windows looking toward the creek and the grain bin and the windmill above them. Whatever she thought of that view over the years, she kept to herself. But she kept the windows clean, which is a way of saying what a person thought of a view without requiring them to say it in words. The padlock she had taken from the grain bin's hasp, she cleaned and oiled and reused on the bin's door. The tumblers worked as well as they ever had once she had cleared the rust with a fine wire and a drop of neat's foot oil. It was a good padlock, soundly made, and she saw no reason to replace what was sound. Her name appears in the Colfax County Assessor's rolls each year from 1884 onward, and in the land patent records in Santa Fe, and in the records of the territorial hearing, and in Fitch's correspondence files, which a historical society acquired in 1921. There is also one entry in a letter written by the federal examiner to his supervisor in Denver, in which he described the contents of the box and the manner of their finding, and said, in passing, that the woman who found them had done so not by accident, but by the particular kind of attention that reads a floor the way a surveyor reads a slope, and that he had rarely encountered a more complete account of a long-buried fraud reduced to its component parts by a person with no legal training and a masonry chisel. The auctioneer who had taken her $9.50 said nothing on the public record. The man who had laughed said nothing on the public record. The county clerk said to her when the examiner's report was made public that he had not thought the windmill parcel was worth buying. She said that the windmill was fine. She was referring to the mill. What she did not say, because she had never been a person who said things that the situation already said for itself, was what every person who had watched her set the tools down and carry that box out of the grain bin already understood, that the thing everyone had walked away from was not worthless. It had been keeping something safe for 8 years, waiting for the one pair of hands that knew how to ask it a question in the language it spoke, which was the language of limestone and iron, and the particular silence of a space that has been closed too carefully to have been closed carelessly. The mill ran for 31 years from the day she freed the shaft. It stood through drought and 2 hard winters and a grasshopper year in the middle of the decade that stripped the grass to bare soil across a 100-mile stretch of the territory. She never had cause to address its gearbox again in the mechanical way. It ran because she had understood what had been done to it, and had undone exactly that thing, and nothing more. The grain bin stands on that land still, though the land has passed through other hands twice since she left it. The limestone floor is intact, one pour, unbroken. The iron rings are set into it flush, and someone walking across that floor in ordinary light would not notice them unless they happen to know what to look for. Tell us, if you have ever found something that everyone around you had given up on, what it was that told you to look again. Leave it below. There are others watching who have stood in that same doorway with a lantern held low and something shifting in the light. There is another story waiting, about a woman and a thing the world had marked as finished, and what she found when she brought it back into the air. Stay close. This story is a work of historical fiction, inspired by the land fraud disputes of the New Mexico Territory in the 1870s and 1880s. All characters, names, and specific events depicted here are imaginary,